Okay, folks, welcome to today's live stream. Wow, there's already 61 people on the call. That's incredible. Thanks so much for coming out this evening. You with us, Takota?
I'm here. You gotta let me turn my video on. You blocked me out already.
I want to take all the credit tonight. That's why. All right, I just made you co-host, so hopefully you can turn your camera on. Great. All right, folks, so we're going to get right into it. Tonight, we thought we would talk about gardening, and specifically, I mean, we're going to talk about gardening tonight, but we can talk about anything to do with growing food. We're currently going through some really interesting stuff on our property right now, and we can span the scales from large all the way down to small, so it doesn't matter if you have an urban property or a rural property. One of the reasons I wanted to talk a little bit about gardening this week was I think it's a really important thing to be thinking about, given what we're currently going through globally, but also given that context, Takota is probably one of the best gardeners that I know, and so I thought we would have a chat about gardening, especially on kind of a larger scale. I don't know, Takota, if you've got earbuds nearby, but I'm getting a little bit of feedback on your end. It might help the audio stream. Okay, folks. So tonight's show is going to be just a little bit different. We're going to start off with about an hour of Takota, is your YouTube channel muted? So just make sure if you're watching the video that you've got it.
It is, yeah, it's off. I'm not sure what's going on here.
Okay, well, maybe it'll fix itself then. All right, so tonight we're going to do a slightly different type of show in that we're going to talk a little bit about some examples based upon what we're doing here. And then we're going to allow you guys to ask questions, and we're actually going to try and invite you guys onto the show. I don't know if it's going to work. We'll have to try the technology, but if it works, then we're going to let folks come into the Zoom room and ask us specific questions about growing food. So let's get into it. Do you want to start off with anything, Takota, before we get into the main content for this evening?
No, I think let's dive into it.
All right, so man, where to start? I think just to give a little bit of context, I've had phone calls from multiple people, a couple of them today actually, saying that they're struggling to get seeds. It's really interesting. People are starting to wake up to the fact that it might be a good idea to grow some of your own food. And you and I have been talking a lot about growing food in the last little while, for the last, as long as I've known you, but specifically in the last little while, in light of this COVID thing, You know, it only takes one person getting sick at one of the meat plants to shut the meat plant down. And there really aren't that many meat plants anymore because we've centralized all of the production in order to make it more, you know, efficient. And so you start recognizing that we all tend to, a lot of us tend to buy our food from these centralized locations, whether they're grocery stores, and those grocery stores buy their food from centralized locations, whether it's fields in California. And while there is some distribution, there is an enormous amount of centralization. And so this year, I think will mark a massive growth in the return to the home garden. And the last time that, you know, a huge percentage of the population was growing food for survival, basic survival, was World War II during the Victory Garden stage, where up to 50% of the food came out of gardens, of backyard gardens, not even off farms. And so we're kind of in a unique place, Michelle and myself, because this year we're actually starting new gardens again, which we haven't done for a decade. We've been growing our food in an urban context, and a lot of it at that. It's amazing what we managed to get out of our small food forest and backyard garden. And so there's some new skills and ideas that we need to bring into the way that we grow food now that we're going to go up to a quarter or a half or even maybe 3/4 of an acre. I don't know what we're going to end up with. I've started mapping it out, but I wanted to be able to ask Takota some questions this year before I do what I tell every other rural person or urban person that moves to a rural environment, which is they get drunk on space. You got all this room now and you just kind of sprawl all over the place. And so I'm really trying to be careful and follow my own advice.
Sure. So one of the things we had planned for tonight was Rob is going to pull up his design, his property design on Google Earth Pro, and using the open source land design tool that we've developed, which you can get on vergepermaculture.ca. We're going to be going through. We're almost going to treat it like a kind of a consultation where Rob's going to ask, you know, me questions, and we're just going to talk through some different things. We're going to go through, you know, where to, how to site a garden, like where should it be located, and then move all the way through to what kind of, you know, crops to plant, how to integrate livestock into that, what kind of tools are necessary, as well as even if we have enough time, how to store some of the foods. And both Rob and I have, you know, I'm going to talk about gardening from my perspective and some what's worked for us, but Rob and Michelle, as Rob mentioned, they've been growing a ton of their own food in an urban setting for years now. And so you're going to see kind of a different perspective on there's a lot of ways you can kind of skin this cat. So we're just going to jump into it.
And you know that I love skinning cats.
Let's hope it doesn't come to that.
Yeah, we're going to be talking about growing food in a slightly more.
Although I've gotten 2 emails this week, people asking me whether or not it would be acceptable to eat rabbits that live in the city, rabbits or deer that live in the city, and how one would go about doing that. So that might have to be another webinar. Yeah.
So as Takota said, I just put a link up there, vergepermaculture.ca/land design. As a result of all the consulting that Takota and I've done, we've built a whole bunch of open source tools. As Takota mentioned, you can go and get your free design tool, which is what we're going to be using this evening. It would make sense that we use our own tools on our own property. And so you can follow along if you want. You can go get that right now. And one of the things that it'll offer you is a contour map, which we'll probably get into on another session when we start talking about water design. I'm not going to bring that up right now, but if you follow the prompts, you'll see how to get your contour map as well. So I'm going to share my screen here, and then we will get right into it. So let me turn off some of the work that I've been doing here so that you can get a sense of what's going on here. I've just started laying out my property, and so what you see right there are kind of the existing fence lines. I should probably turn those off as well. Maybe I'll give people a bit of a tour of what this tool looks like. So if you ever use Google Earth Pro, it's essentially very similar to a file structure that you'll find in a PC, like a Windows machine. And I've actually deleted a couple of the file folders from the tool that you'll download from our website because I don't need them right now. But basically, we always start with a diagnosis step. And so that's kind of the phase that I'm in right now. I'm in a combination of diagnosis and design. And so the reason that we start with diagnosis, Takota and I felt that when people design property, whether it's small or large, they tend to skip the diagnosis phase. They don't spend enough time in observation. And to be totally frank with you, I wasn't planning on doing a whole bunch of development this year. I was going to follow my advice and spend a whole year observing. And to a large part of that is still true, so to speak, because I'm not really going to be touching anything kind of out here in the bush. This is the property that we're currently working with, but I'm going to maintain kind of an observational approach to this part of the land. The parts of the land that I've already kind of developed, we're going to work with this year, but most of what we're going to be talking about today is kind of our zone 1. So I'm going to zoom in here. And what's really cool about Google Earth Pro is that the resolution is really good, but you can also change the timeline up here. And so I actually did this last night. I was looking at different aerial photos that exist within Google Earth Pro. And you can actually, so there's only really 2 photos that I have access to this on this computer or this particular location, but some places have a new photo every single year. And you can really get a sense of what our home site looks like. And so I'm just going to give Takota a little bit of a tour, and then Takota's probably going to ask me some questions around diagnosis questions to help kind of get a sense of where we should be placing our gardens relative to the other infrastructure that exists. So, and Takota has had the advantage of actually being on the property, so he has a little bit of a sense of what's going on here. But this is our main house right here, and you can see that it's mostly south-facing. We've got a 3-car garage, a small little chicken coop, which is being turned into a garden shed right there. It's on skids, it can move. A small little house over here with a fence, sorry, it's right here with a fence all the way around it. Some Saskatoon bushes. This is where the existing garden is right now. We've got a wood shop right over here and a small little, almost like fabric style Quonset with 2 other sheds right here. The Quonset is where the tractor is currently kept, and I've actually got my bunnies in there right now. We've got a small little livestock shelter right here. We've got a triangular kind of corral system, so to speak, a livestock chute and loading system, and kind of an extension to the corral right here, and then another corral down over here. And so one of the other shows that Takota and I have talked about potentially doing is talking about fencing. Fencing is so crucial when we talk about these rural properties. So give her, Takota, why don't you run me through the ringer here?
For sure. So I think the before we get into the weeds, because we've already had a bit of this conversation ourselves, I think it'd be helpful to lay out our one of our lessons we talk about in our courses a lot, and in our book, which is something called the 5 rules of design. So in an ecosystem, you have a bunch of elements. And so elements can be, plants, animals, but they can also be structures, buildings, greenhouses, things like that. So all of those are considered elements. And in an ecosystem, all of these elements interact with each other, and different relationships are formed. Now, every single element has something called needs and yields. So there are things that they require to basically survive and thrive, and there are things that are outputs that they give back to the system. And so, a chicken needs food, water, shelter, other chickens, predator protection, things like that. And they yield things like body heat, they scratch, they yield feathers, they yield eggs, they yield manure, they yield noise, things like that. And so essentially the 5 rules of design is something that Rob and I came up with to help with the designing of ecosystems. So the first rule of design is that every single element on your property, if its needs can't be facilitated from within the system, it results in first work and then pollution. So if your chicken needs food and water and it can't get the food and water itself, you yourself as an element in the system have to provide that for the chicken, or else the chicken will starve and die, thus causing pollution. So that's the first rule of design, is any need of an element that cannot be facilitated from within the system results in first work, then pollution. The second rule of design is that any yield of an element that cannot be put to productive use within the system results in pollution first, then work, then drudgery. So if you can't utilize the chicken's manure, which is a yield, or if you can't utilize the chicken's body heat, or if you can't utilize the amount of eggs that it has, or its feathers, or its scratching, it becomes a waste product. It builds up until it causes problems, and then you either have to come in and do something about it, or it creates kind of a ripple effect on downstream. Classic example of this is if you have a chicken house and you don't clean it properly because you don't value the manure will build up until you either can't get into the door because the straw and the manure will build up, or the methane gas or the nitrogen will get so strong that it will start to cause respiratory problems in your chickens, or in some cases it can actually kill you. There was a farmer in, I believe it was in the Western Producer, they did a story on him where he actually passed out cleaning his chicken house, and he happened to call his wife because he felt lightheaded, and he actually passed out while he was on the phone with her, and she rushed down, and if she hadn't drug him out of the chicken house, he literally would have suffocated because the methane gas was so strong. And so the first 2 rules are directly related to the needs and yields. Any yield of or need of an element you can't facilitate results in work that you have to do to keep the element happy. Any yield that it produces that can't be put to productive use from within the system results in pollution and then work, because you have to step in to do something about it to stop it going to chaos. The third rule of design is every element should serve multiple functions. So if you have chickens on your property, they should do more than just produce eggs. They should be part of your pest management strategy in your garden. They should be part of your fertility management problem. They could be part of a fire break program on your property to keep the grass down around your inner areas. They could be part of a anti-parasitical program for other livestock because they'll scratch through other animals' manure and break it down. They can also be their body heat can be used to keep buildings above freezing in the wintertime. This is one of the things we do on our farm to stop the chicken house from freezing, so that I can continue to ferment my pig food and my chicken food year round without any added inputs. So the third rule of design is every element should serve multiple functions. The fourth rule of design is that every function should be served by multiple elements. So the first one is every element should serve multiple. Design rule number 3 is every element should serve multiple functions. The fourth rule of design is every function should be served by multiple elements. So if the function of chickens is all of those things, pest suppression, fire management, heating the building, food production for yourself, integrated into your gardens, all those things, those are all functions. Every single one of those functions should be provided by something else as well. So essentially what you get is you have a design that is, it's efficient, it's effective, it's multifunctional, it's redundant, it's adaptive. These are all the the descriptive words that you want your design to do. And the way you do this is by arranging elements throughout your property, either by the location that they're positioned, how big the element is, how many of them there are, what time of the year that element is there, or you can also change things like the type of element. So there's multiple different kinds of chickens. There's many different kinds of garden plants that you can grow. And then the fifth rule of design is that if you break any of the first 4 rules of design, it results in drudgery, and drudgery is punishment for stupidity. And so what you'll find is that all of those rules, there's either work that's incurred that you have to do yourself that leads to pollution, or there's pollution that leads to work. But in all those cases, it really amounts to drudgery. It sucks. So that being said, now we've kind of gotten a basis for design. Let's go through and talk about some of the different needs and yields and functions of this element of a garden that we're talking about, and see if we can't use it to locate this placement of this element on Rob's property in relation to the other elements around it. Because that's the thing, is it's kind of like it's like a web. You know, if you move one of the nodules of a web, or you poke it, you're not just touching that spot. Everything else in the web moves with it. And so design actually it's very iterative, and it's an ongoing process. And that's why Google Earth Pro is so helpful, because you can move elements around and see how they would interact with other things before you actually do it in real life. So Rob, what kind of a garden do you want to go through first? Do you want to go through your kitchen garden, or do you want to go through like a main crop garden first? Because both of those have different functions.
Right. So before I answer that, I'm just going to put a link up on YouTube there, and I put it up before. But if you want to go through those 5 rules of design, we just launched a video a couple weeks ago where Takota was actually going through his livestock system and how he's oriented. And so he has this process, he calls it gardening with livestock. What's that quote that you've got about gardeners?
Oh, so all about the philosophers?
Yeah.
All gardeners are philosophers, but not all philosophers garden.
No, there's another one that you have about how easy gardening is.
Oh, so actually, I wanted to start out with this story. So when I quit my job as a carpenter and I came back to the farm, I reached out to my community because I was trying to start a forest garden CSA. Basically, it's like a veggie box CSA, but as opposed to being just 1 year, it'd be stretched for 4 years, because I was trying to plant perennial fruit and nut trees. And so one of the investors in my my forest garden CSA was this fellow by the name of Craig in our local community, and he's also a university professor. And I took part in one of the classes that he was teaching as a community member. And one of the things was we went on a tour through his garden. And in his garden, he had this little plaque that said, "Work is for people who don't know how to garden." And I love this quote, because for me, I had been spending the last 4 years of my life working, sometimes 17 hours a day on construction sites away from the farm, making all this money, but I didn't have time to garden, and so I had to buy all my food, whenever I was working away. And so like it really hit me. I was like, oh man, that's so true. It's like if you don't know how to garden, you have to work somewhere else so that you can make money to pay for your basic needs. And so I kind of told Craig the story, and he ended up giving me the plaque. I actually have it. It's part of my display booth for the hand tools that I sell at farmers markets. But what I learned was, after a couple of years of being on the farm, is that there's a second meaning to that quote. So the first meaning is that if you don't know how to look after your own basic needs, you have to work somewhere else to be able to pay somebody else to do it for you. So work is for people who don't know how to garden. But the second meaning is that if you don't know how to garden, it feels like work. It sucks. It's drudgery, and it's because you're stupid, or at least that's the way that I choose to look at it. And so, one of the things we're going to be talking about today is something I call like 80-20 gardening. It's like what's the 20% of the energy you can put into a garden that allows you to get 80% of the value back, and then the last 20% of the value takes 80% of the energy input. I'm very lazy when it comes to gardening, and as Rob mentioned, there's a lot of YouTube videos on Rob's channel as well as mine about going through some of the specific things. But we're going to be talking about the using Rob's place as a case study here. So why don't you pull your screen back up again there, Rob?
Yeah, and so the reason I wanted Takota to tell that story is because you know, and the title of the talk tonight was Gardening When It Counts. And so as we start to move back into a garden culture, which is one of the benefits I hope we get out of this COVID-19 thing, is that we teach people how to garden effectively. And this is why we spend so much time talking about design and design tools. Is we have this saying in permaculture, 100 hours of thinking, 1 hour of doing. And what we're really trying to get across there is that if we spend enough time on the planning phase, we can save a whole bunch of time on the actual implementation and doing phase. So that's why we're talking about Google Earth Pro this evening. So thanks for sharing that story, Takota. So I think let's start off by talking about, I mean, let's be honest, in the urban setting, I think our whole property was 5,000 square feet. So I just measured this out right here, and this is kind of our home fence, so to speak. And one of the cool things you can do with Google Earth Pro is, let's just look at the perimeter fence here, is you can, no, that's the wrong, let's just see here. I'm just gonna look at home fence, that's the one I want. So our little home yard is 2 acres. So what's that, 90,000 square feet compared to 5,000 square feet. So 20 times as large. And so it's easy to kind of imagine just kind of placing things willy-nilly. And I'm just going to share a couple of observations that I've had so far. So right now, we don't have a basement on this house, which is where we would typically grow some seedlings. We grow seedlings. I know you typically don't. So I want to talk a little bit about why you don't and how you guys get around without kind of enhancing your season by growing seedlings in advance. And so we set it up in this little house, which is where they typically were growing their seedlings. And it is a pain in the ass to walk over here and check our seedlings every single day. We're doing that twice a day. And so, again, kind of thinking about design, one of the things that we talk about with our students is actually mapping out the distance that we walk places and how much time it takes us to go there. And so every time we do that, which is twice a day, we're walking 200 feet. So we're walking 400 feet back and forth to check these seedlings twice a day.
Twice a day. Yeah.
Twice a day. So that's 200 feet each way. So it's oh, you're right. No, it's 800 feet.
It's 800.
I forgot I don't have a transporter at the house.
And if you convert that into meters, a really quick rule of thumb is the average person, unless you're like running, but an average person's pace is about 2 meters per second.
Right.
So what is that? It's at 67
60 meters. So 120 meters both ways.
Yeah.
So 240 meters for the whole day.
So yeah, so basically it's 2 minutes per day just spent walking back and forth, and which doesn't seem a lot, but when you add, like, we only have 24 hours in a day, and you have to sleep for at least 2 hours of that, and so you really start to when you start to get on a bigger property, time is money, literally, and you can start to figure out where your low-hanging fruit is on your property in terms of how much time you're wasting just walking around. And what's interesting is if you do that over the whole year, and then you do that over the whole lifetime, you can actually see like how many hours, days, weeks, months, years of your life are going to be spent just walking from one location to the next. And it is mind-boggling to think about these things. And then you can use that as a decision-making tool because, okay, well, what if I moved that element somewhere else? And yeah, it might take me 2 days to relocate it, but if I'm going to be here for the rest of my life, how much time, like what's the ROI? What's the return on investment in terms of my time before it starts to pay back? And this for me is probably one of this is the zones conversation. So the elements that need you the most, or that you need the most, you put closest to your center of operation or your house. And the further you go out in terms of your zones away from your property, you should be putting elements that need you less or that you need less, as a general rule of thumb. But with Google Earth Pro, you can actually quantify that and use it to make decisions about where you're going to be putting something and convert that into actually a currency to rate it against moving them somewhere else.
Yeah, absolutely. So before we talk about all the different gardens, I mean, most people, what I was getting at with our 5,000 square foot space was that we only really had a kitchen garden. We didn't really have a main crop garden, so to speak. So from a farm or rural or larger land perspective, what are the different types of gardens that you refer to? I think you talked kitchen garden, main crop garden, and food forest. Why don't we just go through those?
Yeah, so again, the probably the easiest way to think about this is in terms of their function. So like a kitchen garden for me is something that you eat out of, like when you're making a meal during the summertime, you want it. I think Bill Mollison had this rule of thumb, which was if you're making an omelet in the morning and you need some herbs from your kitchen garden, if you have to get your slippers wet in order to get the herbs, your kitchen garden is too far away. So literally, it should be just outside your door for a kitchen garden. And what a kitchen garden is just that. It's something that you're eating out of fresh during the year. That's its function. It's basically a living refrigerator. So you're going to have, you might have all of the same things that you would have in your main crop garden. It's just that they're just outside your door, or you might not have as much. The main crop garden is typically storage crops, things that you're going to be eating in our climate for 6 months of the year. The ground is frozen solid at least, and so we have to grow basically double the amount of food that we're going to store somewhere, ferment or preserve somehow to eat the rest of the year. So that's how I differentiate them. Is a kitchen garden you're eating from during the summertime, everything is fresh, because I mean, let's face it. There's no. You haven't lived until you've eaten like fresh baby potatoes, or carrots pulled fresh out of the garden, or lettuce that you just picked 30 seconds. Like it's, there's just no. If you'd ever done that, I can't even describe it to you. You have to try it. But in order to do that efficiently, it literally needs to be. So think of this as a thought experiment, because a lot of people don't. One of the biggest problems I see with gardening is people put it too far away from their center of operation, and they hog tie themselves before they even get started. And so I want you to imagine what it would be like if you had to put your refrigerator in the farthest room in your house or out in your garage. And every time you wanted to grab something from the refrigerator, you had to go out there and get it. And just imagine how much of a pain it would change everything about your eating habits, as you can imagine. Think about it from that perspective, from a kitchen garden. Is you're going to be using it as much as your refrigerator, so you want it nice and close. And so right there, I mean, for Rob's property, for his kitchen garden, you can actually see the shadow lines of his trees, and next to his house there, and also the shadow of the house. there's really only, basically two sides of his property, or of his house, where he can put his kitchen garden. And that's probably going to be something like raised beds, maybe some, cloches, or, small hoop houses, or little cold frames or something like that. And very similar to the gardening that you guys were doing in Calgary. That's going to be right around your house there. But the main crop garden, or actually, before I go into that, do you have anything else to add there?
Well, yeah, I mean, one of the observations that I had, like in my kitchen garden in Calgary, it was literally five feet away from my back door. And now I like, if this is going to be our kitchen garden for this summer, I've got 75 feet to walk just to get to this garden. It's crazy.
Yeah.
And I can see this eventually becoming a main crop garden. We might even change what we do in this area. I think we will probably. But right away when I got here, and being, fond of nature, I didn't really want to do this. So it's taking me some time to kind of come to terms with it. But I'm literally contemplating removing all these trees right here. And to make people feel better, and to probably mostly myself, we are going to get a sawmill. Most of these are 24 to 30 inch spruce trees, and so I'm gonna reclaim every piece of wood that I possibly can out of these trees. But this is honestly, in my opinion, and I'd love your opinion as well, other than the fact that I'm going to have some massive stumps to get rid of, this is honestly the best growing area. This huge, beautiful shelter belt right here. It kind of forms a bit of a sun trap to the south. It's right outside my back door. I've even got a really good location, which I've been eyeing up, for a passive solar greenhouse coming right off the house right here. And so even though I've got to cut some trees down, I'm going to have access to kind of 3 or 4 season growing right here connected to my home, and then kitchen gardens. And then I've got to kind of figure out how I'm going to integrate. So I kind of feel like I've got that kind of sorted out, but I want to think about how I'm going to integrate my main crop gardens, which is something you've done brilliantly, with a hub and spoke system, because I really do want to have my best employees are going to be my livestock. And so we're looking at pigs and chickens, and probably some ducks, and a couple of dairy cows. And so looking at how all of this is laid out, I want to talk a little bit about how you kind of bring your livestock into your gardens, and how to, even potentially into our kitchen gardens. How do we make sure that if our livestock are going to sit down here, that they can seasonally have access to different gardens from time to time?
So first off, I completely agree with you. I think, even if you cut down just the few trees that were closest to your house there, and you can do, the sun angle calculations to figure out, what your growing season is, and how much it's going to shade. Because if you are going to be doing 4 season growing, as you know, those, the winter sun angle is, in our climate, it's only about 14 degrees off the horizon at its azimuth, the highest angle. And so, a lot of these trees are going to be in the way if you do want to put a greenhouse there. But if you're just looking for, spring and summer growing, and maybe a little bit of the fall, you might be able to leave some of them. But you can actually calculate how many of those trees you have to take out, and you've got all the tools and stuff to do that. So before we go into the main crop garden, I want to talk about just a few other little hacks for how you can kind of change your kitchen garden to be really well designed, but maybe go a little bit further away from your center of from it not being right outside your front door. So
Okay.
One of the things that all of the elements on our properties need, for the most part, is us. They need our management. They need our monitoring. They need us to harvest them, or to do anything with them. And so one of the tricks you can do is there's actually, if you have main pathways, for example, you can see the pathway that goes in between your house and your garage right there. you would never put a kitchen garden as far away from your house as where your garage is. But if you put raised beds, or if you had kitchen garden pathways along the path that you walk every day to your garage, if that's something that you do a lot, you can actually kind of break that rule of as opposed to having it right next to your house. You just put it along the pathways that you're always walking on, and then this is how good design literally eliminates work, because now you don't have to make a special trip to go and check on the seedlings. Just by going about your daily activities, you have to go to the garage to, get your vehicles, or if your work clothes are out there, or whatever that is, you're going to be gardening just as a default of it. And then it doesn't feel like work. But if it's a special designated trip to go somewhere else, like right now, all the way over to where your other building is there. Yeah, Rob's just putting those in right, just like that. That's a way that you can expand out from your inner zone and still have all the benefits of having a kitchen garden really close to your inner zones, but have access to more space. And you could do the same thing, say when you start to get livestock, wherever those go. Maybe you could have that kitchen garden out where it is right now. It's just a matter of where your main crop garden is. It's just if you design it so that your path that you walk every single day during the summertime to do your morning chores, because you have to do that anyways, no matter what, it's just alongside your garden way, so that as you're going to milk your cow in the morning and when you're walking back, you're just harvesting your vegetables for that meal, and in the evening you do the same thing. Now, again, my preference and my gut is that you're going to have those raised beds and that greenhouse and stuff around the house, and I think that's probably the best use of that space. But those are just some other ideas for how you can use design, and using that needs and yields thing to adjust the placement of an element, the garden, to actually accomplish work just by its placement.
Yeah,
so,
absolutely.
So going to the main crop garden now, again, the function of a main crop garden is to grow a surplus of food for the seasons that the garden isn't in production. So whether you're in a cold climate like ours or in a tropical climate, typically there's seasons where certain vegetables only grow, and so that's where you'd be producing these things, is they're storage crops. Now, the needs of a garden are, they need for a lot of fertility. Annual vegetables have been bred for thousands of years to thrive off of a lot of nutrients. So I believe it was what's his name here, Martin Crawford, in this book, Creating an Edible Forest Garden. He talks about the nutrient needs of an annual crop versus a perennial crop like a forest garden, and I believe it's 4 times the amount of nitrogen and phosphorus, potassium that an annual crop needs compared to a perennial crop. And that's, again, because they've been bred to get big and fat and grow like they're on steroids, and so that's a really important need to factor there. You're also going to need mulching, shredding, de-weeding, pest control. You're going to need irrigation. You're probably going to need fencing from the amount of livestock, or not the livestock, the amount of wild flora that fauna you have on your property, the deer and the moose and elk and cougars and stuff like that. So right there, we've got quite a few needs that your garden has. And of course, the yields are a little bit more common sense, but right there we can start to get some multifunctionality. Say, for example, out of the fence, you're going to need a deer fence for your main crop garden, and probably for your kitchen garden as well, I'm guessing. So how and this is where things start to spiral out, because everything you need, the more you need, the more you need. So if you need a kitchen garden and then your garden needs a fence, well, then what does the fence need? And then what does that need? What does that? It just fractals out. So this is why multifunctionality helps to kind of put some bounds on that and create an efficient use of resources. So you could design a deer fence, and a deer fence is something, it's probably 6 to 8 feet tall, strong enough to keep out a deer. But you can also do like a spreadsheet calculation where you're looking at, okay, what else needs a fence? Well, chickens need a fence. Other livestock need fences. Certain crops need fences, vines, cucumbers, ground cherries, peas, things like that. They need fences. And so can you design a fence that will keep deer out, keep chickens in, keep foxes and coyotes out, use as a trellis for, vine crops, for grapes or hardy kiwis or whatever it is. And also provide, by doing that, could you also provide wind protection from your garden or a sun trap? And you start to see, right, you can, stack functions by using those five rails of design into something like this. But in order to do that properly, you see how it connects up to everything else. Like, in order for the fence around your garden to be useful to chickens, it needs to be close enough to wherever your chicken house is going to be. And then, where your chickens can't be in your main crop garden all the time, so where are they going to go for the rest of the year? So this is actually, I think this is a great time to, I'm actually going to share my screen here, Rob, or maybe you can. Have you got, I'll share my screen and then we can use the I'm just going to try to find it here. Ooh, my computer is slow. Or maybe it's not going to work. It looks like everything's froze up. I'm trying to find the order of operations, Rob. If you have access to that. It looks like my PowerPoint crashed on me. So.
You mean the 11 property factors? Yeah,
the order of operations. You can just share your Google Earth Pro again, and we can talk about that.
Yep, that's what I'm going to do. Yeah, so when Takota refers to the order of operations, he's talking about the 11 factors that we follow, and it kind of works a little bit similar to PEDMAS, which is what we learned in elementary school with regards to how to deal with mathematics. But this is kind of like the PEDMAS of property design, and so certain things have to come before other things. And so we have 11 factors: climate, geography, water, access, structures, fencing, flora, fauna, business, technology, and soil. And so the way the order of operations is set up is that the things that are on the top, generally the hardest to influence, most expensive to change, climate, and things that are on the bottom are the easiest things to manipulate and change, but only once you get the things above it correct. So a lot of people focus on their soil, which is understandable because that's where your plants are growing. But your soil will actually improve all on its own when you get all the other factors above it correct, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And so, when we're talking about, I just gave an example of like, where do we put the garden? Well, the garden is in flora. And so generally, before you figure out where your garden's going to go, you figure out where the things higher on the order of operations goes. Generally, there's always exceptions to this rule. But so basically what I'm saying is, before you place your garden, you need to know where your fencing is going to go. You need to know where your structures are going to go. You need to know where your access is going to go, where your roads or footpaths are going to go. You need to know where your water systems are going to go. And you need to understand what your geography and your climate and how that's going to influence that. And this is one of the things we say is when you approach design this way and you follow this kind of order of operations, your property literally designs itself. So without getting too much into the weeds here, I know, and there's always iteration here. So again, as soon as you move one thing, everything else moves with it. It's like a web, everything's connected. but for just for experimentation or something Rob and Michelle and I talk about is we play a game called Option Land, which is like, okay, well, what if we did this? What would that look like? How would that play out? Rob has a green square drawn on the screen there. Let's assume that the garden's going to stay there, which I think is a reasonable spot for it to go. You can easily see how you could easily put some kind of a fence, a multi-purpose fence that would work for chickens and deer and pigs and things like that in there. And then you might have your barn or something around the corrals there where you're going to be milking at. And so if you can draw some more squares on there, Rob, just to help people kind of visualize some of this stuff. And then you've got your hub and spoke system set up, or maybe now's the time for me to switch over and show some of my designs that we've got.
Yeah, no, I think that'd be great. I actually really want to see some of the stuff that you're working on. And folks, we're going to get to answering your questions here right away. One of the things that I really like about Takota's systems is how integrated they are. And so we're really trying to mimic what he's got going on his property, because literally he does chores in less than an hour a day. And the amount of production that they get off of their property in the limited amount of time is absolutely incredible. It's actually not that incredible when you think about it. I mean, all they've done is just place things in the right order of operations. It's incredible when you compare it to all the other properties that we've seen where people are literally spending 8-10 hours a day just chasing their tail trying to get things done. And so if you haven't seen his gardening with livestock or his integrated livestock system, I'll share a couple more videos up on YouTube and you can kind of get a sense of it. And all of these systems kind of speak to each other. And now we're in this wonderful situation where we're going to be trying to do something similar so that we can get that level of productivity. Again, the reason is that there's only so many hours in the day. For Michelle and I, we want to grow most of our own food on our property, which I would say is probably a similar goal to what most people on this call are interested in doing. We want to use the least amount of fossil fuels. We want to grow the most nutrient-dense food. We still want to be able to recreate with our kids because we've got lots of trails and they like to bike and ski and all those other things. We have other things that we want to do in our life other than just growing food all day long. But the only way we can do that is by getting the design right. And so I think some of the techniques that the Cohens have evolved over 30 years can be looked at and kind of broken apart, which is one of the reasons I wanted to have this talk tonight. And then you can take those principles and apply them back to the way that you guys are growing potentially on your own property to grow more food in less time.
Absolutely. So I'm just trying to get my computer booted up here. I think I've got it now. All right. So I'm gonna share my desktop here, and I'm going to show you. So this is my property design here. This is actually an aerial photograph of our place. Rob, that's coming through okay?
Yeah, you might want to turn off your video. I'm going to turn mine off too, just while you're sharing your screen there.
Okay, it's pretty slow, eh? Okay. All right, video's off. Let me know if it's breaking up too bad, and I can try to switch. Okay.
I'll just keep trying for a little bit. We'll see if the internet speeds up here.
Okay, so right here you can.
No, it sounds much better now.
Okay, so this is our property here, Cohen Farm. We manage 250 acres as part of our kind of the property that we own, and we also manage another approximately 50 to 60 acres from some neighboring land. But this is the major piece that we have. So zooming into our inner operations here, this is this is my parents' house here. It's a straw bale house, and I live up in this. There's basically a living suite above a shop that we've turned into a commercial kitchen. That's where I do all my milking and meat processing and stuff. And there's a 400 square foot loft, which is where I'm talking to you from right now. So this is our zone 1 in terms of, or actually our zone 0, depending on who's whose books you read, but it's the place where we spend the most amount of time. And you can see right away, we've got raised beds and things that are right around our decks that are easy for us to access for quick things. And then just I think it's about 12 paces into our kitchen garden. So this is actually a bit further away than I would like. I'm actually planning on doing a lot more raised beds and potentially a greenhouse in this nice little sun trap here. So this is north is the top of my screen, south is the bottom. But you can start to see how close that is. Our main door is right here. My main door is right there. So it's really easy to just walk into that kitchen garden. We also have our orchards right out here. And then this is kind of one of our main crop gardens that we started before we got interested in permaculture. And then this is actually one of the main crop garden where I've done most of my work over the past 5 years, which is out here, which is similar to what Rob is going to be setting up a system like this. So essentially how this element fits in with everything else is the things that we're growing out here are storage crops, potatoes, beets, carrots, turnips, radishes, kohlrabi, Jerusalem artichokes. We've also done a lot of squash, and garlic, those and onions, things like that, where you're growing a huge amount, you don't really eat out of it, but you just harvest it once a year, put it into your storage systems, and then you're done with it. The reason why we've located out here is partly because of geography. It's situated on some really flat land. If I turn on my contour maps here, you can see what how flat that land is right there. So it's a really nice garden spot. It's also kind of terraced, or not terraced, it's surrounded rather by some of the water harvesting systems that we have. Actually, I'm going to turn on our water designs there. You can see a little bit more clearly. So these are some of the dams that we've built that capture water. And so this garden is almost like a Chinampa style system. It's kind of like subsurface irrigation, because the water level is only a few feet below where I'm growing gardens. It's really rich soil, and it also happens to be right next to where my integrated livestock system is. So this is where my dairy cows, my pigs, and our chickens. So this is our chicken house here, south facing, has a roof that hangs over that blocks out the summer sun, but it lets the winter sun in. And our pigs and our chickens and our dairy cows come back to the system. It allows me to manage them really efficiently, but then they all range out. So this little kind of green area here is actually a chicken pen. That's a permanent chicken pen. So if we want the chickens to be locked up, if we have predator problems, we can fence them into that. But for the most of the year, the chickens just free range out everywhere else, and I have my garden fenced off. And at certain times of the year, I open a little gate, and my chickens literally walk into my garden. Same with my pigs. They can actually access this garden to do some of my management work. You can actually see some of the little trails that my pigs walk on, and some of the things that the chickens are walking on. But for the rest of the time, these animals range out into the other paddocks that we have around this system. So I'm going to, if I can't get my slide set to come up here, I might just have to show pictures. But we're going to give it another shot here and see if we can see that. How's the audio there, Rob? Is it okay?
So far, so good. Yep.
Okay. So I'm going to. This is there is a presentation that I have online that goes through the majority of the stuff, but I just want to quickly show some of the design systems that we've got for our gardening system here. So actually, here's that image I was looking for earlier. This is the order of operations. So the things at the top are slow and hard to change, and the things at the bottom are easy and fast to change. And that's the way that we break everything down. All right, here we go. So here's just some other aerial photographs that show the property, some of the kitchen gardens and things like that. And the way to think about this system again is based off like a hub and spoke design. So this is the hub of a wheel, and there's different spokes that radiate off of that hub that represent different forage resources for our livestock, our chickens, our pigs, and our dairy cows. And the garden here is one of those spokes. There's several spokes within the garden, and so at different times of the year, I let my chickens and pigs out into that garden to do some of my management for me. So one of the things that we really find useful with our chickens particularly is their ability to mulch and shred. So this is a 40-pound straw bale. I just set it down, cut the strings, and in a few seconds, the chickens ran over, they started checking it out, and within minutes, this is what it looks like. They literally demolish. So that's the yield of that element. Chickens scratch. And if you can't put that to productive use within your system, it results in work and then pollution. So the idea was, everybody knows mulch is good for your garden because it suppresses weeds, it minimizes evaporation, which means you have to water less. It provides habitat for beneficial insects. It also provides, which those beneficial insects then provide nutrients for your plants, and all these good things. It provides habitat, all that stuff. But the problem is, mulch can have some downsides if you're going to be using tillage equipment in your garden for, how do you break it down? How do you incorporate it into your soil afterwards? What if there's weed seeds that are associated with it? Things like that. So it's just an example of how we're using our chickens as an element integrated into our garden to balance out some of those needs and yields so that it doesn't feel like drudgery for us. So this is the way that one of the crops I plant in my main crop garden is garlic. So I use a little rototiller that I disturb the soil. I try to only disturb the soil once per year. And I'm a fan of tillage, appropriate tillage. And that's the key word is appropriate tillage. I'm actually not a big fan, apart from kitchen gardens, of the lasagna style gardening. I think it's a ton of work. I think there's a lot of problems associated with it. It's really easy to screw it up. At least in our context, I've never had much success with it. Annual crops need disturbance to grow in. And whether you achieve that disturbance with a rototiller or a hoe or a broad fork or mulching 3 feet deep so that nothing else can grow, it's still a disturbance. The difference is how is that disturbance fitting in with the rest of your property, particularly in terms of soil health. And so we actually use disturbance as a tool to advance soil health rapidly via our cover cropping and different things like that. And it's way easier to go at it with this approach. I think there's too much time is spent, and I say this begrudgingly because I was one of those people years ago. Oh, you can't till, and it's bad for the soil, and all this stuff. And I'm sure the chat window is just going wild right now with my blasphemy against or supporting tillage. But I'll get into this. So basically, I till the soil once, plant whatever my crop is, then I mulch it, whether that's with straw or with cover crops. And then that crop comes up through the mulch. This is garlic. I typically weed it one time. And then usually around the 15th of July is when I weed it once, and then a month later it's ready to harvest, and that's it. I plant it, I mulch it, I weed it one time, I don't water it at all, and then I harvest it. And these are some of the yields that we're getting. And then right away I put my chickens out into that system, and I just use portable electric fencing. You can buy this at any PV Mart or any farm store cooperative, anywhere you are in the world. Premier One makes it. And you just poke these things into the ground. And now if you have a door on your chicken house, it allows them to go out into your main crop garden. Now my chickens are out here. They're eating the weeds for me. They're manuring the soil. They are handling my pest control, and they're having a ton of fun. Like, the chickens love doing this stuff. And all I have to do is move their feed and water around the garden here in different locations, and that'll help spread out their nutrient source. So that's what it looks like when I get my chickens in there. And these are some other cover crops, some oats and clover. Again, you might think this looks awful and messy and things like that, but it's actually food for somebody else. And so I can also get my pigs into my main crop garden with a single electric fence wire and some step-in posts. And within 6 days, that's what it looks like. So they've incorporated all that mulch. They've fed themselves out of it. They've added their manure directly to the soil. I have never added compost or manure to this garden. And I'll show you a picture of some of the yields that I'm getting out of this. Because for me, that's work, that's drudgery. My animals go out there, they get food, and which is less work for me, and they manure it. So you're literally killing, 2 birds with 1 stone with this system, and everybody's happier as a result of it. So coming back to this mulch here, you see how much straw is part of that system, but after it's gone through those cycles there, that's what it looks like. It's already soil almost in a single cycle or a single growing season. It's the nutrient cycle is very rapid in this kind of a system. Here's a couple other photographs. September 21st, showing a cover crop. The chickens are fenced out there. That's what it looks like a couple weeks later. And you can see the chickens huddled up wherever I fed them. And so I just feed them in different locations, and they fertilize my garden for me. Here's another shot. And so you can see, again, the hubs of that spoke just by using temporary fencing. And I still have crops. These are parsnips here. The potatoes, I'm just in the process of harvesting them, it looks like. But this is where I had my squash, which I harvested earlier before the frost killed them. So here's just another shot showing, actually go up to this guy. This is some of the cover cropping that we do, kind of interplanting. So this is a crop of onions that I underseeded to a plant called crimson clover. It's an annual clover that typically grows in the tropics, but you can buy the cover crop seed here from most cover crop seed distributors. Union Forage is one of the companies that I use. That's nearby. It's like $3.50 a pound or something like that. And if you bought a 50-pound bag of it, it would last you a lifetime. So basically, I came through with where my onions are planted. Once they got big enough and I didn't want to weed them anymore, I actually sprinkled some of this cover crop seed on the ground. Crimson clover has been known to fix, hundreds of pounds of nitrogen per acre, which, again, helps build the soil health, but it also, I'm stacking functions in here. And after I pull my onions out, a couple weeks later, the tops are starting to turn brown. There's not a dead space there. There's actually plants that are still growing. And so this is the same, picture. This was July 12th. This is September 25th. So I pulled my onions. My potatoes are about to get pulled here because we had a killing frost. And then 2 days later, I let my chickens in. I haven't mowed this. I've done nothing. I let my chickens in. And they spend a couple days there. And then I come in and I rototill it to plant my garlic. And this year, or the year that I'm talking about here, I actually had my chickens to spread my straw for me. So, from this picture up here, it took about, these are 100-foot rows, and it would take 2 people half an hour to mulch one of these rows, to spread the straw out. with so basically it's one man hour per row. With this system, I just set the bales down, cut the strings, and let the chickens do the rest of the work. And they had an absolute blast, and you know, it was less work for me. So there you can see just some of the benefits of this. Is the 5 or 6 days later, we had a bit of a snow, and just here's some pictures of, you know, some of the yields that we're getting out of this garden. You know, this is a single hill of potatoes, 45 potatoes in a single hill, 0 fertilization, 0 compost for like 30 years. It's just design is what we're doing this with. So one of the other systems I want to talk about here quickly, which is is the ability to grow your own mulch as close to where you use it as possible. One of the things that most people don't know is so this is because we have a farm and we grow our own grain, or we have access to farms around us that grow their own grain organically. We're able to access non-desiccated straw or organic straw. If the straw that you're buying is not certified organic, or if you don't have a guarantee from a farmer that you trust that it hasn't been desiccated, there's almost a 100% guarantee that the straw has been sprayed with Roundup or glyphosate, which is, in my opinion, one of the worst herbicides that's ever been invented. It's worse than Agent Orange or DDT or any of these chemicals. It's persistent. It lasts for 25 years in the soil. It's patented as a biocide, an antibiotic, and as a herbicide, as well as a pipe cleaner. It actually binds nutrients or minerals out of the soil. So one of the yields of a garden is mulch. And if you don't have access, if you don't have another system that allows you to grow your own mulch via straw like this, the next best option I have found, and probably actually better than straw, is growing your own cover crops right next to where your crop is planted. And Rob, feel free to jump in anywhere here. I know I'm covering a lot of ground here, but I think this is
No, it's great. I think it's fantastic. We're going to get to questions here right away, but I think this is one of the coolest systems that I've seen in the garden. So go for it.
Yeah. So I'm actually going to see if I can pull up to an overhead picture of my garden here. Looks like I don't. I'm going to go here. So this is a little. You can see this right from my iPhoto, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so this is one of our main crop gardens, a little closer to the house. This is actually my mom's garden, and you can see, you know, we've spread some of the straw around to as a mulch system once the plants get a little bit taller. But we also have some cover crop that's growing right next to the crops that we planted. And what I'm going to do is I come through with a scythe, or you could use a sickle or something else like that. You don't want to use a lawnmower because the lawnmower will mulch it up and it turns it into this like paste that actually becomes anaerobic, and it's actually detrimental to soil health. So you want these big leafy fluffy greens. So the way that I do it is I literally just scythe it with whatever direction you're cutting. We'll leave it in a nice windrow or a pile like this. And then what you do is you come along with a little fork and you spread it out. And you can spread it around the crop. You can spread it back on top of the soil again. But the amazing thing is that you can get several cuts per year out of a cover crop like that. So coming back to this now, this would have been done. The potatoes aren't flowering yet, so probably, you know, mid to late July is when this would have been taken. And so this guy here is the same crop that I'm cutting a second time a little bit later in the year. This is probably around August or something like that. And so back in this other picture here, I've cut cover crops like this in between my rows, between 3 to 5 or 6 times in a single growing season. If it's irrigated, you can get a lot more cuts out of it. This is a huge amount of biomass that I'm able to grow in my garden. That I'm growing my own mulch, I'm growing my own fertility. It would have been wasted space anyways in the garden, because you need footpaths or to be able to get access with wheelbarrows and things through your garden. And all you need is a basic hand tool. So one of the things that I do in my kitchen gardens, my main crop gardens, is I actually plant rows of cover crop next to the crops that I know I'm going to need, and the way that I plant them is just with a simple rototiller. So just something like this. It could also be a handheld one. You can use a broad fork. But you basically scatter the seeds on the ground, and then you use disturbance to kill the existing crop, but also to plant the next thing that you're planting. And this is, in my opinion, the simplest way to practice all these, the cover cropping and minimal disturbance gardening, and in a simple system that you're using straight lines. And it's kind of like a hybrid between the way that people used to garden and some of the newer systems that we're talking about that can get a little complicated. But I think that's a pretty good breakdown, and hopefully folks will have some ideas about how they can incorporate some of those ideas into their own gardens here. I'm just going to show a couple other pictures here. This is just, there was a fence here the day before, and now, rotated the pigs through. So they're, digging up the quack grass and any of the weeds, and just having a blast as they're doing it there. So, Rob, do you have any questions, or should I talk about root cellars really quickly? I've got some pictures about that. Or what do you think?
We actually have a couple of questions about root cellars. So yeah, why don't you show us your low-tech root cellar? Before you do that, I just put the Zoom link up into, and I'll put it up again in the chat there. If you guys want to hop into a Zoom room, we can bring you live onto the show here. Takota's going to quickly show his root cellar, because we had a couple of questions about that. And I'll keep an eye out for the attendees, and then we're going to actually bring you onto the call. Keep in mind that we're going to either hear your voice or hear your voice and see your face. It's going to be broadcast live to YouTube. And so you're giving us permission to do so if you're showing up in the actual Zoom room itself.
And
okay.
And if you do call in, your number will be visible to people on the call. There's no way we can hide that from people. So there's no anonymity here, which there shouldn't be. But just be warned if I don't think we're going to have any troublemakers, but people will know who you are. So growing food is one thing. Preserving it in a fashion that allows you to eat for 6 months of the year is another thing. So in my mom has raised 6 kids, and the youngest of 6 kids, out of a garden. From my memory, we have never bought potatoes or beets or onions, or I think we have bought carrots every once in a while. But the majority of our staple food products, we've never purchased in my entire life. And which, you just think about Rob has another plaque in his garden, which I love, which is growing food is like printing your own money. And it's so true. But it's even better than that, because you actually can't buy food like this. Even if you buy like the freshest, best organic food from a CSA, it's still not as fresh as the stuff that you can get in your own garden. Anyways, so beyond like fermentation and dehydrating, which I'll touch on dehydrating a little bit here too. root cellars is bar none the simplest, most cost-effective way to store huge amounts of vegetables. And there's a whole bunch of designs online that you can see, from cinder blocks to slip form, mortar and fieldstone construction, or sea cans, or all these different options. I can't speak to those because I've never used them before. I know people who have different versions of them, and they claim to work, but I have yet to see a root cellar that works as well as this, given the kind of, in terms of storing foods, the longest, given the least amount of cost to develop, and also the least amount of skill required. So essentially, this is a design that my dad actually came up with, based off of the way that everybody used to keep their crops, which was in well pits. So most farm stores sell culverts that they call well pit culverts. So they're 6 foot, 7 foot, 8 foot diameter culverts that are approximately 7 to 10 feet deep, which is what this guy is here. This is an 8 foot deep culvert that's 7 feet in diameter. And so what you essentially do is you bury this in the ground, flush with the ground, and you frame a false wall, or a ceiling on top of it. You insulate that ceiling. This is 2x6. However, we've done some other ones now, and if you're in a cold climate like Alberta, where we had -40 for, I think it was a week or two this summer, or this winter, and so now we're actually insulating with at least 2x8 insulation. So 2x6 layer and then a 2x4 layer to give you to fill in the 2x8 studs. And then you frame yourself a little door, you sheathe it, you can put a little building or a greenhouse or something on top of this. And this root cellar, I have high-low thermometers in there right now, and humidistats. The humidity basically stays at 90%, 90 to 100% humidity, which is ideal for storing root crops. And the temperature doesn't vary by more than it was like 0.2 degrees. So all the root cellars that we have on our farm this year, they stayed at throughout the whole winter with zero electricity. They stay at basically 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius right through the winter, which is, again, the ideal temperature for storing potatoes. So all root crops. So to give you just an idea for this, like when I put in my potatoes from this year, or my carrots or my beets or whatever it is, my parsnips, I'll be pulling out my from vegetables that I put in there a year ago, and they'll be almost identical. In terms of feel, like they're still crunchy, they haven't sprouted. And the cost of this, you can buy one of these well pit culverts. You can also get them from any culvert distributor. Canada Culvert sells them. That's where I got them from direct the last time I bought them. They cost about $1,200 Canadian for like an 8 foot diameter, 10 foot deep style culvert. And if you have an excavator on site, it takes an hour to dig a hole and drop it in, and you can backfill it, and the rest of the stuff is just basically scrap material. So for the cost of a modern day fridge, you can have enough, you can build yourself a root cellar system that will store a year's worth of food with zero electricity for an entire family. You can literally store hundreds of pounds of vegetables in these systems for the cost of a refrigerator. And the lifespan of these culverts, I believe, is rated to, I think it's either 25 or 50 years or something like that. But if they're not wet, they'll last for a lot longer than that. There are well pits that are on lands around us here that are still in great shape, and they're 50 years old. So there's no other comparison you can get in terms of money invested for the value that you get out of it and the security of it. There's nothing else that comes close to that. The other system I want to talk about quickly is solar dehydration. for storage. I'm actually not a fan of pressure canning or canning of any food. I'm super lazy. I know Rob, I've actually never done it, so maybe I'm the wrong person to ask here, but I find it very time consuming, and typically you have to do it unless you're freezing it first and then doing it later. The pressure canning happens during the busiest times of the year, and when your house is already hot, and unless you have a separate kitchen. So we've just never done any of that stuff. The only food preservation that we do is root cellars, dehydration, and fermentation, and we also we blanch and freeze vegetables for storage. But actually, I'm moving away from that. I hardly eat any frozen foods anymore. I'm trying to get away from all those because they're energy consumptive, and they're also they are not as nutritious as the other fermentation and dehydration if they're done properly. And they're also not as resilient because they require the continuous consumption of a energy source, whether you're deriving it from solar panel or the grid. It's not as fragile as something anti-fragile as a food storage system that can keep or even get better at room temperature. So I know that was a lot to take in there, but if I'm going to stop sharing my screen and we can dive into some Q&A.
Yeah, that sounds great. So I'm going to bring on Anderson Gell, I think is how you pronounce it, or Gale. So let's see if we can promote you to a panelist. There we go. Anderson, nice to have you on the show. Thanks for joining us. Did you want to, oh, I think I lost you. Okay, next one, Ashley Taylor. I'm going to promote you, Ashley, to a panelist. And, oh, lost them too. Oh, there they go. Ashley Taylor, nice to have you on the show. Ashley, what's your question? Make sure that you unmute your microphone there.
Hello, can you hear me now?
I sure can, yep.
Yeah, my question is, how do you balance growing food for other people with your own consumption needs? I know it's important to want to promote feeding your community, but you also, again, mentioned the value of your own food being much better than something you could purchase. However, it seems like growing food is also your income or revenue stream.
That's a great question. I'm going to let you take that, Takota, because you're the farmer on the show here.
So I'm going to come at this from a bunch of different ways, but the first one, and this is something that I got from Rob, is if you're, those safety demonstrations they give on airplanes before you take off, or they, show you how to buckle your seatbelt up and tell stupid jokes that you've heard 50 times. But the last thing is where they talk about if the oxygen in the cabin drops, you're supposed to put on your own face mask first before you help anybody else. And I apply the same logic to food production as well. I think, and this comes back to the prime directive of permaculture, which is to focus on taking care of your own basic needs first. And once that's taken care of, then you move out to the next zone. So then it's maybe to your extended family, and then to your community, and then wherever that goes from there. So I would, and the benefit of doing that is you'll learn, you'll make smaller mistakes because you're going to make mistakes, absolutely, and I still do all the time, and there's nothing wrong with it. They're incredible learning experiences. But that's my approach to it, and what we do as well. We grow food for ourselves, and we sell the surplus. That's my approach to farming. And I actually don't sell vegetables, namely because I couldn't charge enough for them. Even despite the efficiency of my systems, the extra time it would take to wash and bag and deliver them somewhere, I couldn't even pay for my time. I don't know how other vegetable producers do it. Well, they do it with scale. They get really big and get cost efficiencies there. Does that answer your question, Ashley?
Yes. And I guess, I don't know, it seems kind of going back to some of your principles where you're trying to decrease your expenses first and then moving out. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. And so I think like if I think everybody should grow their food, no matter how big or small of a property you have, and no matter what other trade or job that you do or that you contribute back to the system. Everybody should know how to grow lettuce and, you know, carrots and potatoes and whatever local food storage crops are appropriate for your area. I think it's an essential skill. And so I really don't, and that would solve so much of the food distribution and food waste in the world, and energy consumption and the plastic, like all that stuff is just wrapped in, even if you buy stuff from a local farmer, it's all wrapped in plastic and stuff. So I personally think that everybody should know how to grow their own vegetables, and the meat production and stuff. That's where it, you know, you need a bigger property for certain animals. But if you have if you live in a balcony in an apartment, you can grow a huge portion of your own. You can have your own kitchen garden basically and keep yourself fresh. It'd be difficult to have storage vegetables, but you can get community gardens. Most cities all around Canada and the world have the opportunity to rent community garden plots, or you can get into spin farming and things like that. Yeah, I actually see it as almost unnecessary to try to produce vegetables for other people, given the direction that we want to go in as a society. But
I guess it's just I've gotten myself into a tricky situation with the COVID situation. My seemingly only source of revenue this summer is starting a CSA program, but I'm worried about devoting too much of my time to the CSA program and not enough time to feed my family.
Yeah, and you know, I tried starting a CSA myself. I know a lot of what's the, I don't want to quote the turnover rate, but it's very high. The turnover rate for farmers who do CSAs, but also for customers who buy CSAs, it's like over 50%. It's really difficult work. The margins are really slim, and you're at the whims of unless you're growing everything in a greenhouse, you're at the whims of the weather. So yeah, I don't know how to. I would certainly focus on growing your own food first, however that works out, and then setting it up as a way to sell the surplus if possible. But I also recognize that there are, you know, Curtis Stone is a colleague of ours, and he has a book called The Urban Farmer, and he talks about how to be profitable as a small scale urban farmer. I just don't know how to do it. I don't know how Curtis does it. I've never looked into it. It's never been my approach. So there are guys that are out there that are succeeding at it, but I know it's not easy.
Okay, thanks, Ashley. All right, so I'm gonna bring Plum on. We'll bring you up to a panelist. Plum, make sure that your YouTube video is muted, and see if we can get you. Can you hear us, Plum? Can you try and speak? Okay, great. Welcome to the show. What kind of question can we answer for you today?
Well, I think you both know I have heaps of questions, but the predominant one is, here we are, end of March, early April, an urban yard with a lot of inexperience on my end. And I've got, like, I was walking around there and I noticed, you know, my perennial mullein plant is just standing dead really tall. Don't know if I should cut that now. My auric is up standing dead. Do I chop that up now? Or maybe your top 5 little checklist of what to do now, late March and April, in terms of the house planning.
So for sure, the auric is a self-seeding annual, and so if you let it go to seed last year, there's going to be a whole bunch of seeds around the plant, and so they should come back on their own. We generally let our plants stay in the ground in an urban environment because we didn't have chickens to chew them down at the end of the season. And the reason we did that was we like to let the roots rot in the ground, which helps to build the soil. So at this stage, you can definitely cut it down. Usually when the snow is gone, we're raking the mulch off of our beds in preparation for either planting our seedlings or planting our plants. So I don't know what's your take on that, Takota?
So there's there's annuals, there's biennials, there's herbaceous perennials, and there's perennials, if you think about it in terms of a scale. So like a perennial is something that if like a like a cherry tree or some kind of a plant that it grows from the same stem and it continues growing from the same stem every year, and it gets bigger every year. You don't want to cut those down because then you lost all the last growth. But mullein is a biennial, and so like it's dead. Like you can the root even itself is dead. But then you've got things like comfrey. So comfrey is a herbaceous perennial. So it grows from the same root every year, but it dies back to the ground every single year. So again, like any of those plants, you can, if it's a herbaceous perennial, you can cut it. You can do whatever you want to the top surface. It's not going to affect down below. And then same thing with your biennials. The first year, they're not going to produce seed like mullein or sweet clover or like carrots, beets, onions. Those are all biennial plants. They don't produce seed until the second year. So if you want them to produce seed, you actually have to leave them in the ground or put them back into the ground. Like if you want to produce your own carrot seed, you have to plant a full-grown carrot into the ground and let it go to seed. So that's just kind of a rule of thumb for how to think about what are the needs of all those different plants. But at this point, you can chop and drop it and incorporate it back into your soil, your compost pile, or whatever works good for you for both those plants.
Great, thank you. And then in terms of indoor kitchen gardening, would you have a recommended like staggered? Oh, well, actually, Rob said you don't start from seed. You go to seedlings.
So we direct seed everything except for tomatoes. So everything else we seed directly into the ground. We don't bother with transplanting or anything else like that. That's our approach to the kind of 80-20 gardening. You can't, although apparently there are some tomatoes, I've never seen them. I think I've heard talk of that you can direct seed them, and they might, if you had them in a greenhouse or something, they might finish off. But even the tomatoes, like I could live without tomatoes. So it's kind of your preference. But there's a lot of, greenhouses have a lot of needs. They need a lot of ventilation. They need a lot of management. They need special watering systems. And there's nothing wrong with that. It just comes down to, if that element can't get that from your system, it results in drudgery and pollution. And given the nature of our work, we found that it works better for us to just direct seed everything. And I actually use wild plants to bring in the swing season. So, as opposed to, starting spinach or something or kale, 3 weeks early, I just eat dandelions when they come out of the ground, or stinging nettles, or, tilia leaves, linden leaves, for my salads first thing in the spring. And that's a way to kind of do the shoulder season gardening as opposed to having a greenhouse. Again, nothing wrong with it. It's just if it doesn't fit within your system, that's a way you can get around it.
Thanks, guys.
Awesome. Great. Okay, I'm gonna bring you back down. We're gonna bring Jason up to panelist, and Jason, you're on. So feel free to ask any questions that you've got. Jason, can you hear us?
You have to unmute yourself, Jason.
Can you hear me
There you
now?
go. Yes.
Okay. Hi, Rob,
Takota.
Hey, how's it going,
Hey,
Jason?
Jason.
I was wondering how seriously you consider your straw. I think all your straw, Takota, comes from your own farm. Is that correct?
It either comes from our farm, or we source it organically, or when we can't do that, we contract straw from a neighbor to ensure that it hasn't been desiccated before.
Okay, so yeah, logistically, of course, you know, from a local farmer, probably industrial grown. We've got
Yeah.
pigs. You know, I plan on using the straw that the pigs have, you know, shit on and used up in the compost. But how seriously, like, should we consider the residual pesticide, herbicide? You know, like how much of a detriment is it, you know, at that point? And also
Sure.
as use for mulch in a garden.
So really good question. And I took Elaine Ingham's soil health course a couple of years ago, and in that course she talked about experiments that she had done doing bioremediation. So basically using living organisms like compost and plants and fungi and things like that to help get rid of toxic chemicals in soil. And this is a kind of an emerging field of reclamation that's happening right now. And one of the experiments she described was a property owner who had, I believe it was black raspberry on his property, or some kind of raspberry plant that was or blackberry is probably what it was. And I think it was in not Los Angeles. I think it was San Francisco, one of those like houses on like the hillside. And this property owner got sick of all of the blackberries, and so he read online somewhere that you could, if you mixed Roundup and diesel fuel together, you kind of create like a super poison that's like super, because Roundup tends to wash off, I guess, but if you mix it with diesel, it becomes a lot more persistent, and it stays on the surface of the plant that absorbs into the root systems. So anyways, this guy sprayed Roundup and diesel fuel all over his backyard, you know, property to try to get rid of all these blackberries, because he wanted to probably plant a lawn. And what happened is they all died, and as predicted, he was happy about that. But then his neighbors started complaining because his slope was starting to slip into their backyards, and their swimming pools in their back porches were starting to fill up with sediment. And so this guy had basically destabilized this entire embankment that his house was built on, and it was in the process of slipping. And given the rich area that he was living in, he was under a lot of pressure to fix this. And anyways, long story short, he ended up contacting a bunch of different contractors. How do we fix this problem? Because he couldn't get anything to grow to restabilize it, because the Roundup and diesel literally would kill anything he planted. So he had two options. One of them was he would cover the entire slope with concrete to stabilize it, and that was like millions of dollars. Or option two was somebody got him in contact with Elaine Ingham, and her plan was to basically cover the entire slope with compost, like really, really good compost with particular kinds of organisms that she had done research on that had the ability to actually metabolize not only diesel fuel, but also Roundup or glyphosate. And I can't remember how long it was, but they covered the whole slope, planted perennials, and it was months within months that when they retested the soil, there was no trace of Roundup in the soil. Now, that being said, the studies that they've done on like the persistent nature of it is, I believe the half-life of Roundup is like 25 years. And as it breaks down, unless it's in the right conditions, like, you know, a system where it's been designed by somebody who really understands organisms, the chemical breaks down into something that's more toxic than it was before. So it becomes more radical, basically. And then for the next 25 years, it's even worse. So the short answer is I don't know. The long answer is it is possible, but you really have to know what you're doing. And so I just tend to err on the side of caution and try to stay away from it as much as I can. But I mean, all this stuff is within reason. Like this stuff is in the air. Like they spray it from planes. It drifts. They know it drifts for kilometers. It's in the water. I just try to minimize my contact with it as much as possible over things that I have control over. So for your situation, Jason, you know, if you have straw that you know has been sprayed with Roundup, just if you can, just try to compost it as much as possible, because it's going to fast track that decomposition process. Making sure it's an aerobic compost, and you might, you know, consider if you are concerned about it, you can look into Elena might have a protocol online. It was a few years since I took her program, but that's kind of my 2 cents. I try to minimize it where I can, but you can also use other sources of material for mulch. Like you can use tree leaves as a mulch source. You can grow your own cover crop, or you can cut grass on your property before it goes to seed. Quackgrass makes excellent mulch.
Yeah.
If you just get a scythe, you know, and you cut it before it goes to seed, it's fantastic in your garden. And you know, a couple $100 on a scythe, you can do all that stuff.
Right. And one other question I had is next to our current garden. I mean, we plant a food forest, and then comes our spreading field, which is behind our garage. And I just wondering,
what did you call it? Sorry,
the spreading field, the leach field for the septic.
Oh yeah, yep.
Yep. And is there any danger to either, well, first of all, planting on top, or to, you know, proximity to that?
Rob, that's a question for you, I think.
So legally, you're not allowed to plant on top of it. And according to the code, you'll damage your field if you do so. The type of field does play a role in how effective that will be. I was at a septic conference. The conference wasn't septic, but it was about septic effluent. And anyhow, I really wanted to ask one of the oldest guys, or the oldest installers in the room, what he thought about planting trees on septic fields. And he said, "Oh yeah, should never do that according to the code. But some of the best fields that have lasted the longest amount of time that I've ever seen have poplars growing out of them." And so the risk that they talk about is that these poplars or willows or whatever, they have very aggressive roots that love water, and so they'll go into the pipes and block them off. But if you ever look up how much water a poplar or willow sucks up in a day, they're basically just putting straws into the honey liquid that makes them grow like crazy. So
Right.
I haven't tested that theory. I have planted trees around septic fields, but they're of a specific type. So the type of septic field that works really well with co-planting of trees, not necessarily edible ones, is a system called an at-grade system. And so these are systems that are designed to be disposing of or putting to productive use effluent at the forest floor level. So they actually dispose of the effluent above grade, and then the effluent is allowed to go through the LFH layer, which is the leaf layer basically that builds up, the duff layer that builds up in the forest, and then the trees pick it up from there. And because the pipe is above grade, the roots won't actually go up into the pipe. Because of the way the code is written, if you don't have a forest, you can basically put an at-grade system and then build the tree system around the at-grade system itself. So you kind of grow the forest after the fact. I suspect that you guys have a rock and pipe system or a standard septic system there. So you do it at your own caution, with your own caution. I don't necessarily recommend it because I don't have any any direct experience saying that it won't destroy your field. Yeah, that's all I can really tell you about septic fields and growing stuff on top of it.
Yeah, I was thinking along the lines of the Earthship Blackwater system that he uses there. Forget the architect's name there.
Mike Reynolds, but yeah, I mean, those are specifically designed for that purpose, right? So
Right.
Yeah. So Jason, like one of the things you could do that would meet code and, you know, solve the other question that you asked, which is where do I access mulch, is plant some kind of a fast growing tall grass like quackgrass.
Quackgrass is all over.
Yeah, it's just don't mow that part of your field with a lawnmower and then scythe it, and
Right.
you turn the problem into the solution. It doesn't go against code, and the quackgrass will grow like the dickens there. And you could cut it 3 or 4 times a year. Like the quackgrass is one of the earliest grasses to grow out of its mulch layer, and yeah, it could actually look like a really neat, like if you left it as like a square, you could have like a path through it or something. It could look very artistic and really nice, and you get a great function out of it as well.
That sounds like a good idea. There is already quackgrass growing. It grows like the dickens, as you say.
Yeah.
However, if there's a blade that does get submerged in the soil of the garden, will it not grow, or does it require part of that root for it to grow?
Oh no, quackgrass only spreads via the roots or the seeds.
Okay.
So you'll be totally fine there.
Cool. Thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks, Jason. Okay, so
Yeah,
the next question is from Paola, and she asks, what kind of cover crop were you growing in those photos, Takota?
So multiple ones, but I'll take a step back and answer the question so that you can figure out what's the best kind of cover crop to grow in your particular context. So when we're dealing with cover crops, the function of a cover crop is to improve soil health through the natural process of photosynthesis, which is basically plants taking soil energy and carbon and turning it into sugars that they dump into the soil via their root exudates to feed soil biology. They also add carbon to the soil later when they die, which creates basically like a battery system for storing energy and water and nutrients and things like that. So in theory, the more diverse a cover crop species you have, the better it's going to be able to turn solar energy into sugars and carbon that will is the end purpose of it all. So you're trying to go for as much diversity as you can. Now, that being said, there are certain kinds of plants you don't want in your garden. So one of the videos I have on my YouTube channel, I think I did it last year, where I actually walked through like the whole step from like the seeding to the planting, seeding my cover crop, how I did it, how I rototilled it in, what rate I seeded it at, all these different things, all the way up to the cutting it. And one of the things I did was rye, fall rye, which is a biennial. So it doesn't produce seed the first year, produces seed the second year. So the first time I'd ever done it, and it didn't work great because it was too productive. I actually had to cut it like every 3 or 4 days, and it was taking over the garden basically. So in a garden situation, my recommendation is you typically want to stick with annual plants. So things like oats, barley, wheat, basically grasses like that grow really fast. But it also depends on what your goals are. Like if your goals are for nitrogen, then you want to get some kind of a nitrogen fixer in there, which in our situation here in Alberta, crimson clover is probably the best bet. You can get Persian clover or Barcine clover. I've played around with those myself. They don't seem to grow as well. It might just be my soil conditions. I don't know. But crimson clover is the one that I like the best for an annual clover, and oats is another one. They're both cheap. They grow really, really fast. You can cut them multiple times, but they won't overwinter. They'll die. The frost will kill them, and they don't spread as much. So that's in my garden. Those are like my two favorite ones. But you can also do things like you can mix in peas in there as well as another annual that'll fix nitrogen. Field, obviously you wouldn't buy like a $3 package of peas. You'd buy a big bag of field peas or seed peas or forage peas from a seed grower or something like that. That would be more cost effective. But again, you can. There's 4 basic groups for plants. You've got cool season and warm season plants, and then you've got broadleafs and grasses. So you can have like a cool season broadleaf or a cool season grass, but you can also have a warm season broadleaf and a warm season grass. And there's different plants that fit into those 4 categories. And ideally, you want to have in a broadacre cover cropping system, you want to have as many of those plants from as many different types of those groups as possible to give you the diversity. But in a garden setting, I'd start out with oats, barley, or wheat, an annual cereal crop, and some kind of annual nitrogen fixer like a peas or a crimson clover. She also has another question here. Actually, and thank you for reminding me, Paola, the one downside to the root cellar design that I put out there is if you have a high water table. So you want to make sure that, basically put it this way, if you have a septic or if you have a, what are they called, pump in your basement, what do you call it?
Sump
I
pump.
can't remember. If you have a sump pump, we don't have one. If you have a sump pump in your basement and it constantly goes, you can't build a root cellar like that. And there's probably not a root cellar you can build on your property because the water table is too
Well, you can
high.
go above grade. You can go above grade and then mount it.
You can, and with like a sea can or something like that. But there, again, I haven't seen, I don't know how well they would store, because you need, the frost in our area goes 4 or 5 feet deep, right? And so you need to have 4 or 5 feet deep of soil at least on top of that root cellar to stop the frost from going into it. And then you've got, structural problems with it collapsing and things like that. So it is tricky if you do have essentially it's like if you've already made a failure in design. If you built a basement that has a sump pump that has to run all the time, you've already lost. And you are not in a secure situation, because if the power goes out, your basement fills with water and your house is unlivable. Food is the last thing you need to worry about there. So she has another question here. Can frost destroy your root cellar? No, because it's a culvert. It's designed to handle the stresses of frost and upheavals. And frost doesn't get down to the base of it, so it can't push it out of the ground. It's actually neat. You can actually see the frost level drop as the year progresses, and by this time of year, you can see the frost line. It's about 2 or 3 feet down, but still the warmth of the ground, the geothermal warmth, is keeping everything else above freezing, which is cool, because then later in the summertime, it actually holds that cool later on in the summer. And I think I haven't had these high-low thermometers in my root cellar during the summertime yet, but I had a different thermometer in there before, and they never went above 10 degrees Celsius, even in the summertime. So it's basically a refrigerator. And you asked if you can pour cement in the bottom, seal. Again, if your water table is that high, it's already, like, you've already kind of lost. We have some root cellars where we pour cement in the bottom, and there's other ones where we just put washed rock. It kind of depends on the context of what you're going for. It's a lot cheaper to just pour gravel in the bottom. But the nice thing about concrete is it's smooth, and you can keep it clean and things like that. However, regardless of what you do, whether you use washed rock or cement or concrete, I do recommend having some kind of a sump pump or a slope the floor so that it goes to a central drain that you can put a suction hose or a sump pump into it in the event that rainwater or something ever does get in there. Which one of the things we do with all of our root cellars, we put buildings over top of them like a garden shed to keep the rainwater off of that so it doesn't wash down the sides of the culvert and get in the bottom, because we have had trouble with that. Even though our water table is very low, it's nowhere near the base of our culvert. We have had rainwater infiltrate down the sides of the culvert and seep up inside of it that way.
So Takota, we're going to take one more question from Alan, but before I do, 2 requests for you guys. If you found this video useful tonight, please hit the like button. It helps the video to track. We put our free time into these this channel to try and help you guys out, and that's a small little thing to ask in terms of a return of surplus and helping the video to track and the channel to track as well. Also, if you're getting value out of these, we're launching our online PDC here in the next coming weeks. I'm going to put a link to it up into our chat window there. We have had a flurry of registrations today, lots of people signing up. We're going to basically be doing this 3 times a week for 10 weeks. So as you go through the growing season, we're going to have experts like Takota, like Carmen Lamoureux. If you go to that website, you'll see all the different teachers that we have involved. I actually think there's going to be a surge of need for people to actually do this professionally as people start to realize that we need gardens again. And it's crazy. We live in a time where gardening is kind of a lost art or becoming a lost art. Back in the 1930s, gardening was what everybody did, and now very few people do it. So if you're interested in that, get in while there's still spots available. We're going to take one more question from Alan, and then we're going to wrap it up today. We're going to be doing these sessions live on Tuesdays until the PDC starts, and then we're going to have to change the date because one of the nights that we teach the permaculture design course on will be Tuesday evening. So I'm going to bring Alan into the chat room, and you can ask your question. Thanks, Alan. Alan, can you hear us?
You're muted there if you're talking.
Hi, folks.
Hey, Alan.
Okay, so thank you both for doing this, first of all. So I'll make this quick. Earlier, Takota, you mentioned you were talking about tillage and the need for disturbance in annual systems. So my question is, which had me thinking about succession. So my question is, what are your thoughts on using annuals to establish a perennial system like an orchard? So if I were to use annuals now to begin establishing a new orchard this fall, are there any crops that you would recommend and or techniques or things that I should be thinking about?
Absolutely, you're bang on the money. That's one of the best ways to establish a forest garden and or perennial plants. And so, but again, without seeing your site, I don't want to speak too much to this. So, one of the hard lessons
for context, Takota, sorry to interrupt. Yeah. For context, I'm in Eastern Ontario, and I'm establishing a half-acre orchard on a relatively flat but wet site at the bottom of a watershed. Okay,
perfect. So yeah, you're in a very different context than us, and you're much less brittle. You have a lot more rainfall, and you're depending on where you are in Ontario and what the cropping history was, your soils could already be in good shape. So this might not be what I'm going to say next might not apply to you, but so you mentioned the successional timeline, which is one of the best ways to think about what are appropriate plants to plant in a particular ecosystem. And so I guess what I would look at is trying to figure out where your existing site is within that successional timeline. So what's your climax ecosystem, and what's like the first species that show up when you do disturb the soil, and whatever that continuum is. Like if you walked away for 400 years or 100 years or whatever it is before it reached the climax ecosystem, where is your property right now on that timeline? Are you towards the the middle or the end or the beginning? And that would then help you to answer the question, like, are annual cover crops going to help that succession or speed it up? Because if your property is already turning into a climax ecosystem, like if you already have black locust and bur oak and hickory and wild plums and stuff growing on your property, I mean, you're probably just ready to go, and you could just use the disturbance to basically create a clean slate to plant the ground cover that you want and get things going. That being said, if your property is early on the successional timeline, like if there's only herbaceous perennials on the property and there was a lot of disturbance in the past history, or the soil is in really poor shape, paradoxically, you might need to hold off a couple of years before you plant your climax ecosystem, because the soil needs to go through those stages of succession in order to have the fertility and the microorganisms built up to be able to support that climax ecosystem. So one of the lessons that I've learned the hard way is that the fastest way to get apples, or to have an apple tree that produces apples, is not to plant an apple tree as soon as possible. It's to create the conditions for an apple tree to thrive. So whatever that looks like for your situation, is focus on creating the conditions that your climax ecosystem, or whatever species you're going to be planting, create the conditions for that to thrive, and that's the best way you're going to get to that scenario. So in my situation, I've planted tens of thousands of dollars worth of fruit trees, and they've died because there was too much wind, there wasn't enough water, there wasn't weed suppression, there wasn't the soil health was poor because it had been overcropped for 30 years. And after 5 years of fighting against the successional timeline, trying to push it too fast, I realized that I need to actually take a step back and go through the earlier stages of succession, like the annuals and the perennials, and build the soil health until I start to see signs that the ecosystem is ready and wants to advance to that climax ecosystem. And then you can just drop trees in the ground and they thrive. So that's the way that I would take a look at your property, is through that successional timeline, and I'll give you hints as to what you need to do next. But regardless, even if you were at the very beginning stages, you can fast track it. Like if it would have taken 100 years naturally, you can do it in 5 or 10 years with things like cover cropping and stuff like that. So based on what I've said there, you can answer that, and then I can give you some suggestions as to what cover crops would work well.
Yeah, that's great. So my field, I'm right on the edge of a riparian on a wetland, and I'm full of goldenrod. So there aren't any trees growing. It's been fallow for about 20 years. I just purchased the property. We're building new, and the previous owner had it sitting there since 1995. No trees have grown, except for on the edge of the wetland where we have some alder and poplar and willow taking over.
Okay.
But for the most part, goldenrod is what I'm dealing with.
Okay. What's the elevation change across your property? Like where are you going to be planting this forest garden, and how far down is the marsh or the water level there?
Yep. So we're at about 68 meters above sea level, and there's less than a 5% grade. We're on a south-facing slope. So the field itself is drying out relatively well right now, but the elevation is not much.
Okay.
We've got maybe less than a meter drop over, say, 400 feet.
Yeah. So you might, this is where I would do some research into I'm not sure what kind of perennial plants you're going to be putting in there, but the water table might be actually too high for a lot of things like apples and stuff like that to grow, because they don't like wet feet. And I think one of the rules of thumbs I've heard is you want to have like at least 6 feet of well-drained soil for most like stone fruit or apple trees and things like that. So if you dig a hole, like auger a hole in the ground down 5 or 6 feet, and it fills up with water, your it might not do well for certain kinds of fruit trees. But there might be other kinds of trees that would grow really well. So now, that being said, you might need to make, swales to get you could dig, trenches to concentrate the amount of dirt and get that 6 feet that way. Is another way to.
The other way that, and I'm not usually a fan of these systems, but in your scenario, hugelkultur might actually solve some of those problems as well. So something to maybe consider.
I'll look into that. Yeah. And just a quick follow up on that. What are your thoughts on drainage? So I guess not drainage tile necessarily, but swales off contour to sort of help mitigate some of that. Because you're right, when I dig, less 2 feet and it starts filling up with water, depending on the time of the year.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. And the one thing that Takota and I laughed really hard at when we were out in Ontario was how obsessed Ontariolites are about draining their ecosystems. And so one of my first teachers and mentor, Jeff Lawton, says that when you have an aquatic system, you just need to move up the food chain a little bit, so to speak. You're dealing with a system that's trying to be 28 times more productive than a terrestrial one. So you might be trying to force function a system that's not wanting to be there, and you might just need to think a little bit outside the box, so to speak, and figure out whether or not there are aquatic systems. And one of the best ways, this is one of the reasons I love permaculture so much, is that first I'll say that you either change your context or you change your land. If you try and force function your land to be something it doesn't want to be, you're going to spend the rest of your life in misery and drudgery. And so if you are open to taking cues from nature, likely the riparian zone goes for a while. And so you can walk down that riparian zone and try and look at other pieces of property to see what's growing really effectively there, and start to modify your system in such a way that you're working with it as opposed to against it. One of the things that Ontario has right, I think, is their aquaculture laws. So you guys have so much freedom to be able to do aquaculture that we can't do here in Alberta. We're only allowed to grow non-native, genetically modified freak fish. In spite of this like rich aquacultural diversity that we have access to in our province, we just can't do it here. But when we looked into the Ontario rules, you guys have got a whole slew of stuff, including snapping turtles, which apparently taste really good. So look at all the options that you have available before you try and force an orchard into a system that isn't going to be a great orchard.
That's a really good point, Rob. Thanks. And one thing that I'll note about Ontario is you're right about the aquaculture laws, but one thing that we sort of have as a hindrance is the conservation authorities sort of controlling what we can do on provincially significant wetlands. So I do have that designation, and it's really just 6 acres of willow shrub that we have to ask a lot of permission if we want to do anything with. So
yeah, and so there's still this is part of the diagnosis work that you can do, is just looking at all the things that the clues from nature that Rob mentioned in terms of what kind of species you could grow in your area. There will undoubtedly be some kind of a food producing crop that you can grow on your land. There's no doubt about that. The question is, what's the best one given your land? Like there's a quote by Wendell Berry, and he said, what does your land want to be, and how can you help it become it? It's another way of looking at it. And you can obviously tweak things, like you can do hugelkultur or swale mounds or raised beds or something like that to balance out some of the needs and yields. But with all of that work that you're doing there, it's just that it's more work. And so the low hanging fruit is, if I walked away and I did absolutely nothing, what would grow here with zero effort whatsoever, and then start from there. And so you might only have 1 or 2 apple trees, and they're they take a lot of energy to make sure that they grow properly, but you might have a whole bunch of, cattails or duck potato and, snapping turtle habitat or for minnows or whatever. And obviously you have to balance out the land use bylaw and the conservancy laws and things like that. But there's absolutely stuff that you can do in this context based on whatever your property's strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats are.
That's perfect.
So
Thank
on
you.
that note, guys, oh yeah, thanks, Alan. It's nice to hear your voice. I see your comments on YouTube all the time. So great to have you live on Zoom. That's great. So on that note, I'm going to throw up another link here for you guys. If you guys are in the same situation as Alan, or Alain, probably, I heard a bit of a French accent there. Then what I'd recommend that you guys do, if I can get there myself, is download our free open source tool and start designing the property of your dreams. It is completely free. It's open source. We've put it all into Google Earth Pro, which is also a free program, and it will help to ask you the right questions that you need to answer in order to be able to design a property and think through these problems, just like we were doing at the beginning of this call, so that you're not fighting against your property, you're actually working with it. And when you do that, everything gets a heck of a lot easier. You start having these insights like Takota was discussing that he's had over the years with his gardens. And it doesn't stop at gardening. It's how do we optimize for renewable energy? How do we design the right buildings? How do we get the right building science involved? How do we harvest rainwater in an appropriate way? Is it even appropriate to harvest rainwater? Do you need to do it? Is it your weak link? There's all these questions. We ask thousands and thousands of questions. The typical consultancy that Takota and I will do, we'll spend 400 to 600 hours just in the diagnosis process. And so we're spending more time because we don't know your property. If you know your property and you have the right questions, you can move through that process a lot quicker, which is why we created those open source tools. So hopefully you guys found that really useful. We'll do this again. We're going to be on next Tuesday. We might show up live again sometime this week. We'll see what happens. If you've got a specific topic or thing that you want us to discuss as a result of this COVID-19 scenario, or what you guys are working through on your own properties, you can send us an email. Make sure you're signed up to our newsletter. I put Takota's YouTube channel as well as his URL in the show notes below, so you can get in touch with Takota directly. He's got a ton of great videos there. He also has a ton of information on his website. Thanks so much, guys, for coming out this evening. Once again, if you want to be part of this community over the next 10 weeks, we've got that online PDC coming. I put a link up in the show notes there. Takota, do you have any last comments before we close out for this evening?
No, I mean, there's so much more I want to say, but we're already past our time here, so we're just gonna have to do more of these things. So again, just to iterate what Rob said, we do listen to your feedback. We appreciate your emails and your comments. That's why we switched over to allowing people to come on and actually talk to try to make it more interactive. If you guys, we try to do like an hour of kind of content where Rob and I are actually discussing something, and then an hour of Q&A. But if you think it's more valuable to just do a straight hour of Q&A, and Rob and I we don't rabble on for an hour, if you think that's more valuable, we can do that too. It's the goal behind this was, how can Rob and I just show up and make our resources available to the community in a way it's functional and enjoyable. So if you have any suggestions about how we can do that, we'd love to hear about them.
Awesome, guys. Well, thanks so much again, Takota, for coming out, and thanks everybody on the chat there. Again, if you want to hit the like button, if you got value out of this, it'd be great. And we'll see you guys next Tuesday.